Hey, people, you know what time it is? That's right, it's time for another adventure at G-Bear's Off-Grid Ways. But today's not an adventure day. Today's an answer questions day. And we got to answer some questions. I'm standing here in the doorway. I'm using my chest holder, camera holder, or cell phone holder, whatever you want to call it, because I want my hands free and I don't want to be tripping over a tripod while I'm trying to get through this video. And today we're going to cover electrical components and their association with solar and wind power and all of that kind of stuff, and what they're for, how to use them, where to put them, things like that, and what they're not for. So, without any further ado, no I don't, I do. All right, so let's get with it. So I'm going to turn around and come back inside here, and then I'm going to be tilting my phone down a little bit so we can see what's on the bench here. And let's see what we got. All right, so we got all kinds of stuff here. Yep, and it's still got the Kaiweets multimeter there, in case we need it. There's a lot of functions that I did not cover in that video due to time. And I was just in contact with the manufacturer because I talked to them about getting the volume on the beeper a little bit louder. They said they don't have any problem hearing it even on my videos, but I have problems hearing it right here in person unless I bring the meter up close to me. But that's not a really important part, not a total integral part of using the multimeter, hearing a beep. You'll see the lights flash, which is just as good. All right, so let's get back to where we were. So David Brook put in a few requests on my comments about wind and solar and what it's different things for. And there was like 7 different items on his list, and things like distribution terminals with an isolated stud, power post J blocks, Busbar shunts, breakers, fuses sizes. Now you know that when I do my videos, I always try to speak in layman's terms. Okay, now these are not terms that you will normally hear from me, but if you're getting involved in wind and solar, you're going to be hearing those terms down the line, like PV combiner box, brake switch for a turbine. This is all stuff that you want to know about and know whether you need it or not. And if you do need it, how the heck do you use it, right? All right, so let's get with it. We're starting off here with a panel box because we're talking about distribution terminals with an isolated stud, okay? Now, normally, what that would basically look like is something like this, okay? And what it does is you're able to connect your one incoming battery cable here and another battery cable here and going out to whatever you want. And then this part is insulated so you can mount it on a firewall or a wall or something like that, and you don't have to worry about these two making contact through whatever you connect it to. Okay, now this one is a switchable. So this one has a switch on it, and you can actually bolt this one right through the firewall of a car or a truck or an RV or whatever, and it comes with a little key like this, and the key fits in right in there, and when you turn the key, you'll hear a click. That will make these two connect together. When you turn the key back the other way, it disconnects those two. So this will allow you to isolate whatever you're going to be connecting to a battery. Now you can use one of these on your solar system where you come off of your battery bank with a cable and then you put another cable on here and go up to your inverter. And red, remember, positive. So you're going to put that on the positive side if possible. Okay, you could put it on the negative side, but it's better on the positive side. So if you ever have to disconnect your inverter from your battery bank for maintenance of some kind, you just take your key, stick it in there, disconnect the power at that point, and you're ready to work on your inverter. Okay, so we got that out of the way. So that's a distribution terminal isolated stud. Okay, these studs are isolated from each other, and they're also isolated from wherever they're mounted. Now, a lot of the stuff that David Brooke asked about are basically the same thing with different names. So don't get confused if you go, no, wait a minute, that does the same thing. Yeah, it does. They just call it something different because everybody who invents something puts their own name to it, you know? It's like Busbar. What's a Busbar? Well, a Busbar can be anything. This is a Busbar in a panel, electrical panel. Okay? Now, this is a Busbar. This is a Busbar. This is a Busbar. No, a Busbar is not the place your drinks come from on a party bus to Vegas. That's a different Busbar. But this is a Busbar. But this can also be called a lug or a double lug. So there's a lot of things that are actually repetitive in electricity. Don't worry about it. Don't get confused. That's why I use layman's terms when I'm talking about them. And this is an isolated bus bar. It's got the Bakelite coating on it, so you can mount it, and you don't have to worry about whatever wires are connected here shorting with your metal shelving or going through your wall. Now, it's been said that wood is not an isolator. Okay, in electricity, they don't consider wood an isolator because wood can absorb moisture, and when it absorbs moisture, it'll make contact between something like this and the wires that are connected in here. So you don't want to ever use wood for an isolator. Out here in the desert, the air is so dry that wood doesn't have moisture in it very long. So, yeah, for low voltage stuff, you can get away with it. But for high voltage stuff, steer clear. You don't want to get jolted. Now, in a panel, this bus bar is actually two bus bars. You see, you got one lug here and one lug here. That's for your 240 volts input. Now, what is 240 volts? Simple. This is going to be easy for you to understand. 240 volts is 2 times 120 volts. In the old days, it was 110 volts. 2 times that was 220. So we use 120, 240 because everything's a little bit more modernized. All right. So this post and this post, every other post, connect to one lug. And then this post and this post connect to another lug. So you got 120 volts coming in on this power line coming from whatever your service. Say you got on-grid service, and it would be coming from the pole down to here. You'd have one hot wire there, the other hot wire there, and then you have a neutral wire which would connect to one of these two lugs down here. And then all of these connectors would be a distribution point. That was another one he asked about, was distribution. Okay, a distribution terminal. This distributes the neutral that's there to all of those different screws. Okay, this is a distribution point for terminals 2 and 4. This is a distribution point for terminals 1 and 3. So when you use a 240 volt breaker, it'll be one of these big ones that's connected together with 2 switches on it and connected together. Now this is a 30 amp 240 volt breaker, and when you connect one of these in here, it's got little hooks on there. Different panels are different, but on this one it hooks in, and then you push it down and snap it into place. Okay, so now this breaker, this side of the breaker is on terminal 3, this side of the breaker is on terminal 4, and that gives you 120 plus 120, you got 240 volts coming out. So here you wouldn't have a black and a white, you'd have a black and a red, or two blacks coming out of here to go to your circuit for 240 volts. Okay? It's that simple. Now, if you take a single breaker like this, then your single breaker would hook under the hook and connect down onto that post down there, and that's only 120 volts coming out. It only has one screw, so you'd have your black wire on there and your white wire on here, and then down here is called a ground bar. So you have your ground wire connected to one of these, because this is where the incoming ground wire would be. You have your hot, your neutral, and your ground coming in from the telephone pole or from your inverter. And this would be your ground to ground the whole box to earth ground. Okay, so all of these are hooked to just directly to the box. They don't have an insulator on them like this does or like this does. So that grounds the whole box so you don't get shocked when you touch the box. All right, real simple. So you wanted to know on breakers, what are the breakers and what are the different ratings for breakers? How do you know what to use? Well, there's a book called the NEC, or the National Electric Code here in this country. And for the National Electric Code, you can go in there and you can get your readings for whatever you need. Now, a lot of the new panels come with information right on them right here. So you can look right inside the book, or inside the cover, and it'll tell you what to use. It'll also tell you what size conduits to use. It'll tell you what size wires to use on the slotted wires. And solid wires, it'll tell you what to use. Now, a good rule of thumb in electrical code, good rule of thumb for all of your household electrical, you're going to be using mostly 120 and 240, single phase. Single phase means that you have one hot wire or two hot wires in the 240, but one hot wire for each 120 volts, okay? So, how do you know what size wire to use for that? Well, rule of thumb, if you're using 14 gauge wire to power something, that would normally be lights in a household. Okay, so for all of your lights in the household, they can get away with 14 gauge. Now, in commercial and industrial, that has to be all 12 gauge. You can't go down to 14 gauge. And I say down, and you say, wait a minute, 14 is a bigger number than 12. Well, in wire sizes, the bigger the number, the smaller the wire. So 22 gauge wire is smaller than 14 gauge wire. All right? Little confusing, but not that hard to understand. So anyway, if you're using 14 gauge wire in household, in residential, you can use 15 amp breaker, because the 14 gauge wire is rated for up to 15 amps of usage. And what makes a breaker pop off when it pops in your unit is heat. So the heat is fed back through the wire, and then inside of here there's a little spring and a little sensor that picks up that heat, and then it'll cause this thing to pop and open up, so you're not feeding electricity to that circuit anymore. Because if you're overheating the wire, that means there's something wrong with that circuit. And you can't put a 20 amp breaker on a 15 amp circuit. That's called overamping. If you do that, then what you're going to do is the wire is not going to pop the breaker because the 20 amp breaker is holding on, waiting for 20 amps of heat to come down, not 15 amps. So you're going to end up with a fire in your wiring system. So don't overamp. Now, if you're using 12 gauge wire, okay, you go to a 20 amp breaker. And that's what this is. It says 20 right on it. Okay, I don't have any 15s left, so I couldn't show you that. But the 20 amp breaker is for 12 gauge wire, which is the next size that you would use in a household. And that usually handles all of your electrical outlets in the wall. Wherever you plug something in the wall, that's on a 20 amp breaker. Now, depending on where that circuitry is going, if it's going to your living room where you're going to be using, plugging in a couple of table lamps, you're going to be plugging in a TV, maybe your stereo or your radio, you're not going to be using a whole lot of amps in there. So all of these electrical outlets in your living room may be on one 20 amp breaker. All right, now if that breaker is popping, it's probably because you plugged in a electric space heater in your living room to try to keep warm and save money on natural gas. Silly. Electricity costs more than natural gas. Turn the heater on. Don't plug in electric space heaters, wall heaters, things like that into a circuit along with your TV and all that other stuff, because remember, I've said it before, heating elements eat up a lot of electricity. They have a high ohms or a high resistance rating. They use a lot of power. They should be banned. Those things cause more fires than Christmas trees in Christmas time. So keep away from electric heaters if you can. Or have an electrician come in and give you a dedicated circuit in that room on its own 20 amp breaker, so nothing else is plugged in, just that one heater. And don't go plugging your hair dryer in and the same circuit while the heater's running. You'll pop the circuit in an instant. Okay? All right. So for 15 gauge wire, you're going to be, no, for 15 amp breaker, you're going to be using 14 gauge wire. For a 20 amp breaker, you're going to use 12 gauge wire. Don't put 10 gauge wire in a 20 amp breaker. It will fit. You see the size of the hole on the screw there. It will fit, but you're going to be overamping, because a 30 amp breaker is designed to carry more power for like a 240 volt circuit. You'll very seldom ever have a 30 amp circuit for just a single electrical outlet room in your house. In commercial, you could have a 30 amp circuit for the kitchen areas, like in a restaurant, to run their toaster or something like that. It'll be one 30 amp breaker with 10 gauge wire that goes to a single outlet rated at 30 amps for that one heating element. Okay, so for your house, stay clear of that. You're going to be working with 15s and 20s. Now you'll get your 30s, 40s, and 50 amps and even higher when you're using 240 volts. And those will come in with your air conditioners, electric ovens and ranges, things like that. So you're going to be using 240 volts, 30 amps. You're going to be using 10 gauge wire to run to those items. So yeah, that's where those come in. Now these two go with this panel that was originally going to be my manual cutoff switch for my generator on my Ames inverter. All right, let's move on. So PV combine. Oh no, let's stop. Let's go back to shunt. What is a shunt? You'll hear shunt when you're talking about usually residential solar. What a shunt is basically either a manual or a automatic, and they usually use an automatic shunt. in residential solar for on-grid connections. And what it does is, if the power goes out from the electric company's power coming into your panel, it disconnects your solar from your panel so that you're not backfeeding electricity through the whole grid while some guy out there is trying to work on the pole thinking that his boss has shut down the grid in that area so there's no electricity there, so he doesn't get electrocuted thinking that it's okay, there's no electricity up here. He wouldn't do that because they're professionals. But just to make sure, for safety's sake, if a wire is down on the ground and the controller can shut off that grid, that part of the grid, they don't want power feeding back from the other side before those repairmen get there and have some little kid go over there and pick it up and get electrocuted because your solar panels are backfeeding. So that's what a shunt does. Basically, a shunt reroutes electricity in a different direction in solar. And it's much like the switch on the railroad tracks. So you come to a Y in the tracks. You got one coming here, and the train can go either to the left or the right. So they throw a manual switch or an automatic switch, and it allows them to go the opposite direction. That's what a shunt is, okay? So if you hear that word, that's all it is. Okay, so different breakers and fuses we went over. This breaker I didn't cover because you very seldom are going to be dealing with one of these. These are usually used for things like a jacuzzi. All right, so you're going to power it, and the white wire coming out of here means it's a GFCI. That stands for Ground Fault Circuit Interrupter. And you see it's got a test button on here. So you would have that in the on position, press the test button, and that would pop to the off position. Okay? So you got your two wires here coming out and only a single connection on here. So what's that mean? Well, you see the white dot? Oh, you see the white dot right there? That means that on your circuit, the wires coming or going to your jacuzzi, if it's a 120 volt system, the white wire would go in that hole and your black wire or the hot would go in there, and then this neutral will connect to the neutral bar inside of your panel. So this gives you added protection against a short around water, so that if you're sitting in the jacuzzi and there's a ground fault, it would only take 0.5 of an amp for that thing to pop, and it would save your life. All right? Another breaker, a DC breaker, and this is isolated. These type of breakers actually plug onto something. And this type of breaker is for like, well, the kids with their car stereos and their boom boom music. They'll use one of these to go between the battery and the power unit or power amp that they're using. So this, you press the button and the breaker pops. So it's disconnected. Put it back together and it's connected again. These can be mounted underneath the hood of a car and you can drive through the rain. They're waterproof. You don't have to worry about water getting inside of them. Okay, so you can use one of these on your solar off-grid for separating circuitry. Like say you want the incoming solar wire from your solar panels, connect on one of these, and then come on this side and then go out to your controller. So if you need to disconnect your solar panels from the controller, simple push of a button and you're disconnected. Okay, so this is 100 amp. You can get them in all different ratings, so you'd have to know how many solar panels you're using. Okay, the next one is going to be PV combiner box. What's that mean? That's photovoltaic combiner box. So your photovoltaic Voltaic means solar. Okay, just basically that means solar. So these are basically the same thing as a combiner box, but these are combiner hubs. Now you see this one's got the male at one end and a female at the other one. So you got plus there and negative there. And then here you got all negatives, and here you got all positives. Okay, so you can have all of your solar panels in parallel, all the positive wires from your solar panel just connecting to each one of these. And then you'd have all the negatives from all your solar panels, each solar panel, going to each one of these. And that would give you 6 solar panels and 6 solar panels, and then 1 and 1 on the other side going to your controller. All right, so you can combine all of those in parallel. Now remember, when you're connecting solar panels in parallel, your amps go up, but your voltage stays down. So if it's a 12 volt panel, you're going to stay at 12 volts on the panel, but your amps, or if they're 5 amps per panel, you're going to multiply 5 times 6, and you're going to have 30 amps going in. All right, so they also make them in smaller sizes here. And this is basically, just picture this mounted in a box like this, going through these holes at the bottom, and you'd have these 2 connectors inside the box, and then you'd have these 4 connectors outside. So now you could take 2 strings. Remember, a string of solar panels is hooking them in series. That's where you go positive to negative, from the positive from the first panel, positive from the first panel to the negative of the second panel, positive of the second panel to the negative of the third panel, and so forth and so on. So you can mount those in series, and you can up your voltage coming in, but keep the amps the same. So on 12 volt unit, if you had 2 panels connected together, or even 3 panels connected together, then you would have 3 times 12 volts, which is 36 volts coming in, but your amps would still only be 5 amps. All right, so one of these would be for the positive, one would be for the negative, and it tells you right on there what they're for: positive, negative, positive, negative. Okay, so you would come in with 2 separate strings at 36 volts. You're still at 36 volts because now you're going parallel, but then you have 1 negative and 1 positive wire that can go to your solar controller. It's that simple. They also make them in this type. Okay, so this is a wired string. Okay, so you got all the negatives on here, and you got the positive up here. And then on the other one, it's the exact opposite. You got all the positives down here, and 1 negative up there. So this would be where all your strings of solar panels come in, and this is where they would go. This ends would go to your controller, your charge controller. Okay, it's that simple. It's really not hard to know all of this stuff. So now the last thing before we're getting really long here, but let me get to the last thing here, the brake switch for a turbine. Okay, I don't use one. Why? Because a brake switch for a turbine is designed for 3-phase turbines only. You wouldn't do that on a single phase with just 2 wires coming in, your positive and negative. You'd have it with the 3 of the same color wires coming off your turbine coming in. That's a 3-phase, okay? It's an AC turbine. So you would use that on that, but only if your turbine is less than 1500 watts or 50 amps. Okay, so if you use it on anything larger, you're just going to blow up your turbine and have a fire. So you do not want to use a brake on a larger turbine. And I don't like using the electronic brakes on turbines anyway, because what it does, remember you got 3 wires coming in on a 3-phase AC turbine. All 3 of those are hot. And what it does for a brake is it shorts across all 3 of those. It shorts them out. and that causes a magnetic lock in the turbine itself, so the turbine doesn't want to turn. But in a high wind, it's going to force it to turn. And if it does, it's going to burn out your stator inside of that alternator up there on your turbine. So I don't like using them. I just get one that's rated for more or higher than the winds that I'll ever have to worry about. And like mine is a 1850 watt turbine. It's a KT5 from Thermodyne. And the 1850 watts coming out of that I will never see, because it would take 90-mile-per-hour winds for me to see that. That's its max rating. That's as fast as it will go. Now, it would have to be a 100-mile-an-hour wind or even a 95-mile-an-hour wind to cause that turbine any damage just normally running. So why in the world would I want to put a brake on it? Okay? Now, if you're going to buy a cheap Chinese unit that's designed for 50-mile-per-hour winds, and you live in an area where you constantly get 60 or 70-mile-an-hour winds, then yeah, you're going to want to just upgrade your turbine. Don't put a brake on it. Brakes cause problems, okay? The original brakes they made was a hinged tail on the back end of a turbine so that they could pop a catch, and the tail would turn and align itself with the blades of the turbine, so the wind couldn't, the turbine can't be turned into the wind to catch the wind and turn. Those worked pretty good, but there are too many parts, too many things to wear out, so stay away from it. All right, everybody, that's about all I have for today's video. I know it's gone long here. I hope you all enjoyed it. This is G-Bear reminding you, thumbs ups down there, and don't forget to subscribe and share. G-Bear signing off.